On a cold October morning in 1307, the King of France struck like a trap, snapping shut. Across the kingdom, the Knights Templar were seized in a single coordinated sweep. Men who had guarded pilgrims, financed monarchs, built fortresses, and answered only to the Pope were suddenly dragged from their houses and accused of crimes so severe they sounded less like legal charges than a weapon. But at La Rochelle, something was missing. The Templar fleet. The ships that should have been there were gone. Not captured, not burned, not listed neatly in royal inventories. Gone. Before the arrests began. And that absence is where the mystery begins. Not with treasure, not with secret maps, not even with the legends that came later. It begins with timing, because fleets do not vanish by accident. Ships require crews, supplies, orders, tides, and purpose. A harbor does not empty itself in a moment of panic. If the vessels of La Rochelle had departed before Philip IV's men arrived, then someone may have known the storm was coming. So tonight, we follow that missing wake. We begin in France, under a king drowning in debt and ambition, and an order whose power had become too visible to ignore. We move toward the Atlantic coast, to a port where wealth, documents, and personnel may have passed through hands trained to leave very little behind. And we ask a careful question, not a sensational one. What can the record actually show us, and where does it fall silent? Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. The story of the vanished Templar fleet survives because it sits in a perfect gap, large enough for suspicion, narrow enough to resist proof. In that gap, history and legend have been arguing for 7 centuries, and La Rochelle still waits at the edge of the map. The arrests did not begin with shouting in the streets. They began with sealed orders. That is the detail worth sitting with. King Philip IV of France did not simply wake one morning and decide to crush the Knights Templar in a public fit of rage. The blow was prepared in advance. Instructions were drawn up. Officials were told what to do. Men in royal service were expected to act at the same time, across a wide territory, against an order that was not merely wealthy, but organized, armed, and deeply connected. For Philip, secrecy mattered. If word reached the Templars too early, the entire operation could fail. And yet, the mystery of La Rochelle suggests the possibility that secrecy was not perfect. This is where the story becomes less like a legend and more like a problem of logistics. The Templars were not a village militia. They were a transnational institution with houses, farms, fortresses, treasuries, ships, legal privileges, and experienced administrators spread across Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. Their power did not rest only on swords and horses. It rested on information. They knew how to move money without moving coins. They knew how to send messages across long distances. They knew which roads were safe, which ports could be trusted, which officials could be paid, and which rumors deserved attention. That does not mean they had a perfect spy network. The later image of the Templars as a shadow government, silently controlling kings from behind a curtain, belongs more to fiction than to the 13th century. But they were not naive. An order that had survived crusades, sieges, papal politics, royal debts, and the collapse of Christian power in the Holy Land would have understood danger when it began to gather. And danger had been gathering around them for years. Philip IV was not just any king. He was a ruler with a cold sense of royal authority and a very expensive state to run. His wars, his administration, and his political ambitions required money, constantly. The Templars had once served monarchs as bankers and custodians of funds, and Philip himself had reasons to look at their wealth with interest. Their independence also made them inconvenient. They answered to the Pope, not to the French crown. On paper, this was a religious privilege. In practice, it meant there existed within Philip's kingdom a powerful organization he could not fully command. That kind of independence is tolerable when it is useful. It becomes irritating when the bills come due. By 1307, accusations against the Templars were already circulating. Some were lurid. Some were politically convenient. Some may have been built from coerced testimony, fear, and the medieval appetite for scandal when an enemy needed to be destroyed cleanly in public. What matters for our question is not whether the charges were true. What matters is whether the Templars could sense that accusation was being shaped into policy. A royal campaign leaves traces before it officially begins. Clerks write. Messengers ride. Local officials receive instructions they are not supposed to discuss. Supplies are arranged. Prisons are prepared. People talk in corridors. A servant hears something. A minor officer repeats something after wine. A nervous ally sends a warning because he owes a favor, or because he fears being on the wrong side of a disaster. History often turns not on grand secrets, but on small leaks. So when we ask whether the Templars knew, we should be careful. There is no clean surviving document that says, the fleet sailed because a warning arrived. There is no captain's log, no dramatic letter, no list of ships departing under moonlight with treasure in the hold. The evidence is thinner than the legend wants it to be. But the timing invites attention. If vessels associated with the Templars were absent from La Rochelle when the royal net closed, there are only a few broad possibilities. They may have been away for ordinary reasons: trade, supply, transport, communication, or work connected to the order's far-flung properties. Medieval ships were not museum pieces moored neatly for future historians to count. Ports were living systems. Ships came and went according to season, contract, weather, and need. That is the sober explanation. But there is another possibility, and it cannot be dismissed simply because later writers made it theatrical. The departure may have been deliberate, not necessarily a frantic escape with treasure chests stacked to the mast. More likely, if it happened, it would have been quieter. Documents removed, portable wealth shifted, key personnel reassigned, certain ships ordered out before the trap closed. An evacuation does not need to look dramatic to be important. In fact, the most successful evacuation is the one that looks like routine business. This is one of the reasons the La Rochelle story has endured. It does not depend entirely on fantasy. It depends on a real political crisis, a real maritime network, and a real absence in the record. That absence is not proof of a conspiracy, but it is also not meaningless. The Templars had reasons to prepare. They had the structure to communicate. They had ports that could move people and goods beyond immediate royal control, and they had enemies who were no longer merely whispering. Still, we should resist the easy version of the story. A secret council, a final order, a fleet slipping out in perfect formation while the king's men slept. That scene belongs to adventure novels. The more convincing possibility is messier and more human. Perhaps warnings arrived in fragments. Perhaps some commanders believed them and others did not. Perhaps one house prepared while another remained exposed. Perhaps La Rochelle acted because its position on the Atlantic made action possible. The tragedy of the arrests is that many Templars clearly did not escape. They were taken, imprisoned, interrogated, and broken by the machinery of royal accusation. If the order had been fully prepared, the sweep would not have succeeded so widely. So whatever warning existed, if it existed at all, was incomplete. That may be the most believable version, not a master plan, but a partial awareness. Enough to move ships, not enough to save the order. And there, the mystery tightens. Because the question is no longer simply whether the Templars knew Philip was coming. The sharper question is whether someone at La Rochelle knew just enough, just early enough, to send the fleet beyond the reach of the crown. La Rochelle was not the kind of place a king could ignore. It sat on the Atlantic coast with the practical confidence of a working port. Salt air, timber, rope, wet stone, merchants bargaining in several accents, and ships arriving with holds full of things that rarely announced their true importance. Grain, wine, wool, coin, letters, men traveling under ordinary names. Cargo listed plainly enough to satisfy an official, but not always plainly enough to satisfy history. For the Knights Templar, a port like La Rochelle mattered because the order was not only a military brotherhood, it was also a machine for movement. That is one of the most misunderstood things about the Templars. People tend to picture them frozen in a single image. White mantles, red crosses, horses, swords, the heat of crusader battle. That image is not wrong exactly. It is just incomplete. By the early 14th century, the order was also a landlord, a banker, a courier system, a religious corporation, and a logistical network stretched across borders. A crusading order could not survive on courage alone. Courage does not feed a garrison. Courage does not pay shipwrights. Courage does not move silver across Europe or keep legal privileges intact while kings argue with popes. Behind the battlefield version of the Templars was a quieter army of administrators, clerks, stewards, chaplains, sailors, and servants who made the institution function. La Rochelle belonged to that quieter world. Its value was geographical before it was mysterious. From the Atlantic coast of France, ships could move toward England, the Iberian Peninsula, the Western Mediterranean, or farther into the open sea. In an age when roads could be slow, dangerous, and politically complicated, a ship was not merely transport. It was an escape route, a warehouse, a messenger, and sometimes a vault. That last word has given the port its legend, vault. The mind hears it, and immediately begins filling the darkness with gold. And yes, the Templars handled wealth. They held deposits. They transferred funds. They possessed land and rents. They had treasure houses and financial records. Their reputation for wealth was not invented from nothing. Philip IV would not have moved against a poor order with the same appetite. But wealth in the medieval world was not always a mountain of coins waiting in chests. It could be rights to income. It could be debts owed. It could be account books, seals, charters, ledgers, correspondence, title documents, and the quiet authority to say, "This belongs to us, and here is the proof." In that sense, documents could be as dangerous as silver. A royal officer could seize coins and count them. But a set of records could reveal obligations, embarrass patrons, protect property, expose transactions, or preserve the institutional memory of an order under attack. If La Rochelle stored anything truly sensitive, it may not have glittered. It may have been folded, sealed, and written in a clerk's careful hand. That is less cinematic than a sacred relic wrapped in silk, but perhaps more believable. The port also mattered because it offered distance from the center of royal power. Paris was Philip's world. Courts, ministers, clerks, prisons, the heavy architecture of command. La Rochelle was still within the kingdom, but it faced outward. Its horizon was not a road leading deeper into France. It was water. And water complicates authority. A king could send men to arrest a commander in a preceptory. He could take possession of a building, interrogate prisoners, inventory goods, seal doors. But ships are different. If they are present, they can be seized. If they have sailed, the law arrives at an empty berth. That is why the absence at La Rochelle matters so much. not because it proves that the Templars escaped with all their wealth. It does not. Not because it proves they crossed the Atlantic or founded some hidden maritime lineage. It does not. It matters because the port was exactly the kind of place where removal, concealment, or redistribution could happen before the machinery of arrest reached full force. Imagine the practical scene without embellishment. A ship is loaded with barrels, sacks, and sealed bundles. Some cargo is ordinary, some may not be. A few men know the true destination, most do not. The harbor does not stop to announce a mystery. Sailors complain about weather. Dock workers want payment. A captain watches the tide. An order is given that sounds like any other order in a port built on movement. By morning, the ship is simply gone. This is how history loses things. Not always in flames, not always in battle, sometimes by routine. La Rochelle was not just a backdrop for the Templar legend. It was the one environment where a legend of disappearance could become plausible. A stronghold on land can be surrounded. A treasury can be opened. A prisoner can be forced to speak. But a fleet, once at sea, enters a realm where records become thinner, loyalties become harder to trace, and distance itself becomes a kind of defense. That does not mean the ships carried the secret heart of the order. It means the port offered possibilities that an inland commandery did not. And possibilities are dangerous to historians because they invite imagination. Yet they are also necessary, because history is not only what survives in documents, it is also the study of what people could realistically have done under pressure. At La Rochelle, the Templars had access to ships, personnel, storage, and routes beyond immediate reach. They had reasons to protect assets, whether financial, administrative, or human. They may have had warning. They certainly had enemies. So when the story turns toward the vanished fleet, it is not drifting away from reality into pure myth. It is following the logic of the port. By the time royal officials reached for Templar property, they were entering a world already designed to confuse the hand that tried to seize it. This is not because the Templars were magicians of secrecy. It is because medieval administration was both meticulous and fragile. A charter could preserve a right for generations. A missing charter could bury that right almost completely. A ship could appear in one account, vanish from another, and leave behind no satisfying trail for anyone hoping to reconstruct its final voyage 700 years later. The disappearance of the fleet at La Rochelle sits exactly in that uncomfortable space. There are stories that speak confidently of 18 ships leaving the harbor. Some later versions imagine them heavily loaded, departing in the night, their decks crowded with knights, treasure, and forbidden knowledge. It is a powerful image. Too powerful, perhaps. The more cinematic a claim becomes, the more carefully it should be handled. What can be said with more confidence is narrower. La Rochelle was associated with Templar maritime activity. The order possessed the kind of network that could make use of ships. When the arrests came in October 1307, the expected seizure of Templar assets did not produce the neat, satisfying account of a captured fleet that the legend almost demands. That gap has become the seed of everything that followed. But a gap is not the same as a footprint. This is where the investigator has to slow down. If a fleet truly departed before the arrests, we would want to know several things. Which ships? Under whose command? With what cargo? What destination was declared? Who saw them leave? Did port officials record it? Did royal officers complain afterward? Did any surviving Templar testimony mention the movement? The problem is that the story grows louder precisely where the record grows thin. That does not make the disappearance false. It means the event cannot be handled like a courtroom confession. We are dealing with absence, and absence is a slippery kind of evidence. It can suggest concealment, It can also suggest normal loss, incomplete archives, administrative disorder, or the simple fact that not every medieval ship movement was recorded in a way that survived. There is a temptation, especially with the Templars, to treat every silence as deliberate. No inventory, suppression, no witness, secret oath, no destination, hidden mission. It is an understandable temptation, because the Order's downfall was so dramatic that it seems to deserve an equally dramatic escape. But history is not obliged to balance itself for narrative satisfaction. The arrests in France created a violent break in the paper trail. Properties were seized by officials who had their own priorities. Some records were kept because they mattered to revenue. Others were ignored because they did not. Some may have been lost in later wars, fires, neglect, or ordinary decay. A medieval archive was not a cloud backup with better handwriting. It was vulnerable wood, parchment, wax, storage habits, and luck. So when we look toward La Rochelle, we have to hold two possibilities at once. The first is practical. Templar ships may have already been away on normal business. They may have been carrying goods, personnel, funds, or correspondence unrelated to the coming arrests. If so, the later legend may have taken an ordinary absence and dressed it in the robes of conspiracy. The second possibility is more deliberate. Someone may have recognized danger early enough to move assets out of reach. Not the entire order, not every knight, not the vast treasure of modern fantasy, but something valuable enough to protect. Money, records, portable goods, senior personnel, or evidence that could help surviving Templars reorganize elsewhere. Both possibilities fit parts of the world we know. Neither can be proven cleanly from the surviving record. That is why the disappearance itself is less like a single dramatic scene and more like a damaged map. You can see the coastline, you can guess at the route, but the central line has been rubbed away. Imagine a royal officer arriving after the arrests, expecting property that should be converted into the king's control. He finds buildings, lands, perhaps goods that can be listed. Men can be questioned. Locks can be broken. The machinery of seizure can begin. But the harbor refuses to cooperate with the logic of land. A stable can be counted. A storehouse can be sealed. A ship that has left the tide behind becomes a rumor, and rumors travel faster than ledgers. What makes La Rochelle different from many other Templar sites is not that we possess a perfect account of what happened there. It is that the setting allowed something to happen without leaving the kind of evidence we crave. The port offered movement, the Atlantic offered distance. The Order's structure offered the possibility of coordination. Philip's secrecy, if breached even slightly, offered motive. Still, we must be honest about the limits. There is no secure surviving manifest that tells us the fleet carried the Templar treasury. There is no confirmed list of relics placed aboard. There is no reliable witness standing on the quay, naming the ships as they passed into open water. Later traditions may preserve a memory of movement, or they may reflect the human habit of filling archival darkness with meaningful shape. The absence of witnesses is especially interesting, but not in the obvious way. It does not prove that everyone was silenced. Medieval ports were full of people whose lives rarely entered written history. Dockhands, pilots, servants, fishermen, hired crewmen. They may have seen things and left no trace at all. Their silence is not necessarily conspiracy. It is class, literacy, bureaucracy, and time. The past often belongs to the people who had clerks. That is the quiet cruelty of this mystery. If the fleet sailed, many eyes may have watched it go. Yet none of those eyes speak to us with certainty now. So the best reconstruction is cautious. Sometime before or around the crisis of October 1307, ships connected in some way to the Templar world were not where later imagination expects them to be. Their absence became attached to La Rochelle because the port was important, because the order had reasons to move valuables, and because the arrests created a sudden need to explain what had escaped seizure. The departure, if deliberate, was probably not the operatic flight of a doomed brotherhood carrying the secrets of civilization into the West. It was more likely an administrative act under pressure. Orders sent, cargo shifted, men selected, records bundled. A route chosen that only a few needed to know. That version is less spectacular, but it has a colder power, because it suggests competence, not prophecy, not magic, not a perfect conspiracy, just people inside a threatened institution doing what institutions do when danger becomes visible, preserving what can be preserved before the doors are forced open. And if that is what happened at La Rochelle, then the real mystery is not simply that ships disappeared. It is that the disappearance may have worked. The word treasure has done more to distort the Templar story than almost any accusation made against them. It is too bright a word. It pulls the eye away from everything else. Say Templar treasure, and the imagination immediately supplies the rest. Iron-bound chests, golden cups, jeweled reliquaries, perhaps a sacred object wrapped in cloth and carried by men who know they are guarding the fate of the world. It is almost impossible not to see it. The image has been polished by novels, films, late-night documentaries, and the very human belief that if something vanished, it must have been valuable in the most obvious way. But the first question is not what the fleet carried. The first question is what the Templars actually had to lose. By 1307, the Order's wealth was real, but it was not the simple treasure mountain of legend. Much of their power was rooted in land, rents, privileges, debts, buildings, farms, mills, vineyards, and obligations owed across different regions. That kind of wealth does not fit conveniently into a ship's hold. You cannot load a legal right into a barrel. You cannot sail away with a harvest that has not yet grown. This matters because it changes the shape of the mystery. If ships left La Rochelle, they were unlikely to have carried the wealth of the Templars in any total sense. The order was too large, too scattered, and too deeply embedded in property systems for its fortune to be packed up like household furniture before sunrise. A great deal of what Philip IV wanted was fixed in place. Estates, revenues, buildings, and the authority attached to them. So the more realistic question is narrower, and therefore more interesting. What portable things would have mattered enough to move? Coin, certainly, if coin was available. Silver could be transferred, gold could be hidden, precious vessels could be packed, but portable wealth might also have meant account books, debt records, seals, correspondence, lists of allies, charters, papal privileges, inventories, and legal proofs. These items would not dazzle a treasure hunter, but to a medieval institution under attack, they could be vital. A chest of coins buys time. A chest of documents preserves identity. That distinction is easy to miss from a modern distance. We are trained by adventure stories to think of value as something heavy, glittering, and cursed, preferably with a lid that creaks. The medieval world often located value in recognition. Who owed whom? Who had granted what? Which seal proved legitimacy? Which charter protected a property from seizure? Which account revealed a royal debt someone powerful might prefer forgotten? A document could outlive a sword. It could also threaten a king. Now, this does not mean we should invent secret archives because they feel satisfying. There is no solid evidence that the fleet carried forbidden religious texts, the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, or any of the other sacred burdens later imagination has assigned to the Templars. Those claims belong to a different layer of the story. the layer where absence becomes invitation and invitation becomes industry. The evidence is thinner here, yet it would be just as careless to swing too far in the other direction and pretend there was nothing worth protecting. The Templars were financially sophisticated. They handled deposits. They participated in long-distance transfers. They maintained administrative records across territories. When an institution like that faces sudden seizure, its most sensitive possessions are not always the most beautiful. Sometimes they are the most boring. And history, with a dry little smile, often hides its explosives in boring places. Think of an account ledger. No gold leaf, no sacred geometry. Just names, numbers, obligations, payments, balances. To the wrong person, dull. To the right person, dangerous. Such a record might reveal who trusted the order, who depended on it, who owed it money, or how funds had been moved. In the hands of survivors, it could help rebuild networks. In the hands of enemies, it could be used to dismantle them. So when later legends speak of treasure, we should not simply laugh them away. We should translate the word. Treasure may not mean what legend thinks it means. It may mean liquidity. It may mean proof. It may mean leverage. It may mean continuity. There is also the question of relics. The Templars, as a religious military order, lived in a world where relics mattered deeply. Sacred objects could carry prestige, devotional power, political symbolism, and institutional legitimacy. It is not absurd to imagine that the order possessed valued religious items. Many churches and religious houses did, but imagining possession is not the same as proving transport. And proving transport is not the same as proving a grand secret mission. This is where the story requires discipline. A relic aboard a ship would be plausible in a broad medieval sense. A specific world-changing relic aboard a specific vessel, leaving La Rochelle before the arrests, is another claim entirely. That second claim demands evidence, not atmosphere. And atmosphere has been doing a lot of unpaid labor in Templar lore. The real drama may be more practical. If someone at La Rochelle decided to move assets, they would have had to choose quickly. Heavy objects slow a ship. Too much visible wealth attracts notice. Personnel take space. Horses are difficult. Documents can be bundled. Coins can be divided. Seals can be hidden on a person. Letters can be burned if capture becomes likely. An evacuation is an act of triage. You save what gives the future a chance. That is why the treasure question cannot be separated from the survival question. If the fleet carried anything of importance, its value may have been measured not in splendor, but in usefulness after catastrophe. The order in France was about to be shattered. Men would be arrested. Confessions would be extracted. Properties would be seized. Reputation would be poisoned. Under those conditions, the most precious cargo might have been whatever allowed some fragment of the Templar world to remain coherent beyond Philip's reach. Money could fund escape. Records could proof claims. Experienced men could carry memory. And memory for an institution under assault is a kind of treasure, too. Of course, we should keep one hand firmly on the table. The vanished fleet may not have carried a grand cargo at all. It may have been absent for ordinary commercial reasons. The treasure story may have grown afterward, because a missing fleet without treasure feels unfinished, and people do not like unfinished stories. They want a reason large enough to match the disappearance. That is how legends improve reality without permission. A few ships become a fleet. A few valuables become an immense hoard. A missing inventory becomes proof of concealment. A rumor becomes a map. A map becomes a curse. By the time the story reaches the modern world, it has acquired enough decoration to sink the original vessel. And yet, Beneath the decoration, a serious question remains. When Philip's officials moved against the Templars, did they capture everything they hoped to capture? Or had some portion of the order's movable wealth, administrative memory, or human leadership already slipped away? That is the version of the treasure question worth keeping. Not because it gives us glittering certainty, but because it preserves the tension between what medieval power looked like and what modern legend wants it to look like. The Templars' true valuables may have been less romantic than the objects imagined later, and more dangerous. Gold can be melted. Relics can be hidden. But records can accuse, defend, connect, and survive. So if something left La Rochelle, the most haunting possibility is not that it carried a mythical prize known only to initiates. It is that it carried the practical tools of an order refusing, quietly and efficiently, to disappear when the king commanded it to vanish. Scotland enters this story not as a neat solution, but as a place where the usual rules looked slightly bent. By the early 14th century, Scotland was not a peaceful refuge waiting politely at the edge of the map. It was a kingdom at war, contested, wounded, and led by Robert the Bruce, a king whose position had been shaped by violence, politics, and excommunication. He was not exactly the sort of ruler who would tremble because distant church authorities disapproved of him. That detail has made Scotland attractive to those who imagine fugitive Templars looking for a land where papal condemnation carried less practical force. It is easy to see why the theory has survived. A persecuted military order, a rebellious king, a northern kingdom resisting English pressure, a fleet leaving the Atlantic coast. Put those pieces beside one another, and the mind begins arranging them into a pattern almost before the evidence has been invited into the room. But patterns can be seductive. The first thing to understand is that Scotland in this period was useful to legend because it was politically complicated. Philip IV's reach was strongest in France. The papal campaign against the Templars spread wider, but enforcement depended on local rulers, local priorities, and local appetite. In some places, the order was arrested and dismantled. In others, the process was slower, softer, or simply less central to urgent political life. Scotland had urgent problems of its own. For Robert the Bruce, survival mattered more than theological tidiness. He was fighting to secure his kingship, resisting English domination, and navigating a landscape where loyalty could shift with the weather, the harvest, or the next army seen on the road. A handful of trained fighting men would have been useful. So would money. So would ships. So would people who knew how to move resources quietly. That is the practical core of the Scottish theory. Not that Bruce necessarily received a secret Templar armada with banners snapping in the wind. That version is too clean, too theatrical, and far too convenient. The more plausible version, if any such connection existed, would be smaller and harder to trace. Individual Templars escaping north, assets moving through intermediaries, experienced soldiers absorbed into local forces without announcing who they had once served. A fugitive rarely introduces himself by his most dangerous title. This is where the story becomes genuinely difficult. The Templars were not unknown in Britain. The order had lands and houses outside France, including in England and Scotland. So the idea that some men connected to the order could have found themselves in Scottish territory is not absurd. Movement across borders was possible. Loyalties were messy. The collapse of the order in France did not instantly erase every person who had worn the cross. But the leap from possibility to proof is wide. There is no secure, contemporary record showing the La Rochelle fleet arriving in Scotland with Templar treasure. No reliable harbor account places the missing ships there. No surviving royal document from Bruce clearly says, in effect, the fugitives have arrived, and we are putting them to use. The theory depends on circumstance, later tradition. Theory depends, and the appealing fit between Scotland's political isolation and the Templars' sudden need for safety. That does not make it worthless. It makes it provisional. Some stories survive because they are false but beautiful. Others survive because they are unproven but possible in just enough ways to remain irritating. Scotland belongs to the second category. It refuses to become fact, but it also refuses to disappear entirely. Consider the timing. The arrests in France came in 1307. The formal suppression of the order would unfold over the following years. During that interval, men connected to the Templars had choices to make, though not always good ones. Some submitted, some were imprisoned, some tried to defend themselves legally, others may have fled. If a Templar had reason to avoid French authority and distrust papal process, Scotland offered distance, conflict, and a ruler whose own relationship with church sanction was already strained. In other words, Scotland was not safe because it was quiet. It was safe, if at all, because it was noisy. War creates cover. Movement of men becomes normal. Supplies vanish into campaigns. Outsiders can be useful without being carefully labeled. In a stable kingdom, a suspicious stranger attracts attention. In a kingdom fighting for survival, he may simply be asked whether he can ride, fight, build, sail, or pay. That is not romance. That is wartime pragmatism. Still, we should not turn Bruce into a secret protector of the Templars simply because the idea is satisfying. He had his own cause, his own legitimacy to defend, and his own political calculations. Welcoming condemned fugitives too openly could have created complications. Even a king under excommunication understood the value of not collecting unnecessary enemies, as most rulers do unless they have a rare talent for self-sabotage. So if Templars reached Scotland, discretion would have been essential. They may not have arrived as the Templars at all. They may have arrived as skilled men with useful experience, a former knight, a sailor, a clerk, a financier, a brother with knowledge of estates, roots, or military discipline. Their value would not have required a grand ceremony. It would have required silence, usefulness, and the ability to blend into a cause larger than themselves. This possibility changes the emotional weight of the mystery. Instead of imagining the entire order escaping intact, we imagine fragments, human fragments. Men whose world had collapsed, carrying not just relics or records, but habits of command, methods of accounting, memories of comrades under interrogation, and perhaps the shock of realizing that vows and privileges had not protected them from royal power. A fleet, if it came to Scotland, would not have brought a shining resurrection. It would have brought survivors. And survivors are complicated. They do not always make history in their own names. Sometimes they disappear into other institutions, other wars, other loyalties. They become part of the landscape so thoroughly that later historians can only detect a change in texture, not a signature. And that may be the strongest version of the Scotland theory. Not a hidden kingdom of Templars, not a secret army waiting in the hills, but an absorption. Men and resources moving into a place where their skills could be used and their identities quietly softened. The weakness of the theory remains the same. We lack the hard evidence needed to say it happened. The absence of proof cannot be replaced by enthusiasm. A good mystery deserves better than that. Yet Scotland remains on the route map of speculation because it answers several practical questions at once. It was outside Philip's immediate control. It had conflict enough to obscure arrivals. It had a ruler with reasons to value experienced fighters and resources. It had existing connections to the broader Templar world. And it stood, politically and geographically, at a useful distance from the prisons of France. So perhaps the fleet did not sail there. Perhaps only a few men did. Perhaps no one from La Rochelle reached Scotland at all. And the entire connection is a later attempt to give the missing ships a destination worthy of the legend. But if you were a frightened brother of a condemned order in 1307, holding a little money, a dangerous letter, or simply the knowledge that the king's men had not yet found you, Scotland would have had one great advantage. It was not France. And in that autumn, that may have been enough. The name Bannockburn gives the Scottish theory its most dramatic battlefield. 7 years after the arrests in France, Robert the Bruce faced the forces of Edward II near Stirling. The battle, fought in 1314, became one of the defining victories in Scotland's struggle for independence. It had all the ingredients that later legend loves: a threatened king, a larger enemy, desperate stakes, and a sudden triumph that seemed to demand an explanation beyond ordinary strategy. Into that space, the Templars were invited. According to one enduring version of the story, fugitive knights of the dissolved order appeared on the Scottish side at Bannockburn, fighting for Bruce when their own future had been destroyed elsewhere. Some tellings make them decisive, almost like a hidden reserve arriving at the crucial moment. The image is powerful, the broken order returning, not beneath its own banner, but inside another nation's fight for survival. It is also exactly the kind of image that must be handled with care. Bannockburn was not a miracle that requires Templar intervention to explain it. Robert the Bruce and his commanders were not helpless amateurs waiting for mysterious cavalry to rescue them from history. The Scottish victory can be understood through terrain, tactics, discipline, English misjudgment, and Bruce's ability to force the battle into conditions that favored his forces. To insert the Templars as the secret key risks doing something unfair to the people who were actually there. It turns Scottish strategy into someone else's legend. That does not mean no former Templar could possibly have fought in Bruce's ranks. That is a different question. Individual men displaced by the destruction of the order may have sought service wherever they could find safety and purpose. War has always absorbed men with complicated pasts. A trained fighter does not stop being trained because a pope suppresses his order or a king seizes its property. But the stronger claim, that Templar knights arrived as an organized force and helped decide the battle, rests on much weaker ground. The evidence is thin, late, and tangled with romance. This is one of the patterns we have to keep noticing. The Templar story often grows most elaborate where the documentation is weakest. A missing fleet becomes a hidden migration. A hidden migration becomes military aid. Military aid becomes a battlefield intervention. By the time the legend reaches its fullest form, the uncertainty that began the story has been converted into certainty by repetition. That is not how evidence works. Still, the Bannockburn connection survives because it solves a problem for the imagination. If the fleet went to Scotland, then surely it must have mattered there. And if it mattered there, what greater proof than the battle that became a symbol of Scottish resistance? Legends prefer visible outcomes. They want the hidden ships to produce a public thunderclap. But real influence, if it existed, may have been quieter. A former Templar in Scotland would not need to appear as part of a secret cavalry charge to be useful. He might serve as an experienced soldier among many others. He might help with organization, supply, scouting, fortification, or finance. He might bring knowledge learned in campaigns far from Scotland. He might simply add one skilled body to a struggle that needed every skilled body it could find. Those possibilities are modest. They are also harder to disprove, and that is why they deserve to remain separate from the more spectacular claim. There is a serious difference between saying some former Templars may have ended up in Scotland and entered military service, and saying the Templars won Bannockburn. The first is plausible but unproven. The second is a legend wearing armor. The distinction matters because it protects the mystery from becoming cheap. The fall of the Templars was real. Their dispersal was real. The uncertainty around their movable assets and personnel is real. But when every unexplained success in medieval Europe is quietly handed to the Templars, the order stops being historical and becomes a universal spare key. Need a hidden treasure? Templars. Need a secret archive? Templars. Need a surprising battlefield victory? Templars again, arriving right on cue. At some point, mystery becomes a habit rather than an investigation. Bannockburn is more interesting when we resist that habit. Because if former Templars were present, their presence would not necessarily have been glorious. It might have been anonymous. A man who had once belonged to one of Christendom's most powerful military orders could have stood in a muddy field under another commander's orders, stripped of his old institutional identity, fighting not for a grand Templar restoration, but because survival had narrowed his choices. That is a more human possibility, and perhaps a darker one. The romantic version imagines secret knights preserving a hidden tradition. The human version imagines displaced men becoming useful wherever history had not yet cornered them. Their old vows, old comrades, and old possessions may have been gone. Their skills remained. Their memories remained. Their need for protection remained. If such men fought at Bannockburn, the battle did not belong to them. They belonged briefly and quietly to it. There is also a political reason the legend is attractive. The Templars, after their suppression, became symbols of persecuted righteousness for many later writers, even when that righteousness was shaped more by imagination than by evidence. Robert the Bruce, too, could be cast as a defiant ruler standing outside the approval of powerful authorities. Joining the two stories creates a satisfying moral arrangement. The condemned order aids the embattled king, and together they defeat a stronger enemy. It feels like historical justice, but history is rarely that tidy. The sources for Bannockburn do not require a hidden Templar explanation. The battle's outcome can be studied without invoking a secret brotherhood. And the absence of clear contemporary testimony should make us cautious. Not dismissive, necessarily, but cautious. So what should we do with the Bannockburn claim? We should place it where it belongs. In the borderland between plausible individual movement and unsupported, organized intervention. Former Templars may have found refuge in Scotland. Some may have entered Bruce's service. A few could even have been present at Bannockburn. But the grand tale of a Templar force emerging to decide the battle remains unproven, shaped more by later fascination than by firm documentation. That conclusion may disappoint anyone looking for the clean, cinematic moment, but it gives us something better. It gives us proportion. The vanished fleet does not need to explain Bannockburn in order to remain mysterious. Scotland does not need a secret army in order to be a possible refuge. The Templars do not need to win another nation's battle in order for their disappearance to matter. Sometimes the more restrained version is the one that keeps the past alive, because it leaves the people inside it recognizable, not symbols, not puzzle pieces, not hooded figures placed wherever the story needs them. People. Men caught between royal ambition, papal authority, and the brutal fact that the world they had served had suddenly decided it could survive without them. And if any of them stood with Bruce in 1314, they did so in a battle already full of danger, mud, calculation, and fear, not as ghosts from a vanished fleet, but as survivors trying to remain useful in a world that had turned against their name. Portugal offers a different kind of survival story. Not the dramatic flight into mist, not the battlefield rumor, not the hidden fleet vanishing into a northern war. Portugal's connection to the Templars is quieter, more bureaucratic, and in some ways more revealing. Because here, The order did not simply disappear into legend. It was transformed. That may be the most important word. Transformed. After the suppression of the Knights Templar, their fate varied from kingdom to kingdom. In France, the attack had been severe, public, and politically useful to Philip IV. But outside France, rulers did not always have the same appetite for destruction. Some had benefited from the Templars. Some understood their military and administrative value. Some were less eager to turn a functioning network of property, personnel, and frontier experience into ruins simply because the French crown had forced the issue. Portugal was one of the places where the story changed shape. There, the legacy of the Templars eventually continued through the Order of Christ. The name altered. The legal identity altered. The dangerous brand of Templar was set aside. But personnel, lands, habits, and institutional memory could survive under a new arrangement. It was, in effect, a medieval act of political laundering, not in the modern criminal sense, but in the older sense of making something suspect appear acceptable again by passing it through the right authority. It was survival by paperwork, and paperwork, as we have seen, can be more powerful than a sword. The Portuguese case matters because it reminds us that the end of the Templars was not equally final everywhere. An institution can be condemned at the center and still leave pieces of itself embedded at the edges. Men can change mantles. Properties can be reassigned. Archives can be absorbed. A symbol can be retired while the practical knowledge behind it continues to work. This is why some theories place the missing ships, or at least some portion of Templar assets, on a route toward Portugal. The idea has a certain logic. Portugal had Atlantic ports. It had a ruler with reasons to preserve useful military religious resources. It sat outside the immediate reach of Philip's hand. And later, Portuguese maritime history would become so extraordinary that it almost invites people to search backward for hidden origins. But that invitation can be dangerous. The Order of Christ did become important in Portugal's later maritime world. That is true. Yet jumping from that fact to the claim that the La Rochelle fleet sailed directly into Portuguese protection with secret treasure aboard is a much larger step. It may be possible. It is not securely proven. Still, Portugal deserves careful attention because it offers something Scotland does not: an institutional bridge. In Scotland, the theory often depends on fugitives being absorbed into war. In Portugal, the question is whether an order's structure could be legally repurposed. That is a different kind of mystery. Less cinematic, perhaps. But historically, it may be more plausible that assets survive through reclassification than through grand escape. A condemned name can be dangerous. A useful estate is still useful. A trained administrator is still trained. A sailor who knows the Atlantic coast does not forget the coast because a decree has changed the politics of his employment. If any resources from La Rochelle moved south, they would not necessarily have arrived as part of a secret armada. They could have moved in fragments. A ship here, a cargo there, a clerk carrying records, a brother traveling under another protection. Coin transferred through contacts rather than carried in one glittering mass. The more practical the movement, the less visible it becomes. And that is exactly what makes it difficult to trace. Medieval survival rarely looks like a straight line. It looks like substitution. One legal owner replaces another. One seal replaces another seal. One command structure is dissolved, then partially reappears under a safer name. The public story says a dangerous order has ended. The administrative reality says many of its assets have found a new container. Portugal's Order of Christ may be the clearest example of that container, but we should avoid turning it into a perfect hiding place for every Templar rumor. Not every missing record ended up there. Not every fugitive became Portuguese. Not every later voyage into the Atlantic carries a Templar shadow behind it. History becomes lazy when it treats one surviving institution as a storage room for all unresolved mysteries. The stronger point is more restrained. Portugal shows that the Templar world did not vanish in a single stroke. It fractured. Some fragments were crushed, some were transferred, some were renamed, some, perhaps, were carried by ship before hostile hands could seize them. If La Rochelle's missing vessels had a destination that combined Atlantic access, political distance, and a future for former Templar assets, Portugal is not an absurd candidate. It is also not a solved answer. There is no firm surviving record that ties the vanished fleet from La Rochelle directly to the founding or enrichment of the Order of Christ. The line is suggestive, not proven. The temptation is to draw it dark and clean across the map. La Rochelle to Portugal, Templar to Christ, secrecy to exploration. But real evidence usually refuses such elegant behavior. It comes broken. It comes partial. It asks us to separate continuity from conspiracy. Continuity is visible in Portugal. The Templar inheritance did not simply evaporate. It was redirected into a new form that could exist within Christian Europe without carrying the full danger of the old name. That alone is remarkable. It tells us something about political intelligence, about the value of military orders, and about how rulers could protect useful institutions by changing their skin. Conspiracy is the larger claim, that the missing fleet transported a hidden core of Templar power to Portugal, where it silently shaped future voyages and guarded secrets across generations. That version may be attractive, but the evidence is far thinner. It belongs in the realm of possibility and speculation, not established fact. And yet, Portugal's role changes the mood of the investigation. Until now, the missing fleet has felt like an absence, an empty harbor, a gap in royal seizure, a rumor moving northward. Portugal introduces a different possibility, not disappearance, but conversion. Not the fleet sailing into oblivion, but some part of the Templar world finding a way to become legally visible again under another name. There is something almost unsettling about that. A destroyed order is simple. It ends. Its buildings are seized. Its leaders are judged. Its name becomes a warning. But a transformed order is harder to bury. It keeps moving through records, titles, lands, and habits. It survives not by defying authority openly, but by convincing authority that it can still be useful. In that sense, Portugal may offer the most realistic kind of Templar afterlife. Not a secret kingdom, not a hidden treasure island, a signature on a document, a new cross on an old inheritance, a set of skills preserved because no practical ruler throws away useful men unless he can afford the loss. So if the ships of La Rochelle did turn south, their cargo may not have needed to be mythical to matter. They may have carried what every collapsing institution hopes to preserve: movable wealth, trusted personnel, records of obligation, and the knowledge of how to begin again without calling it resurrection. The legend searches for the place where the Templars vanished. Portugal suggests a quieter answer. Perhaps some of them did not vanish at all. Perhaps they changed their name. Beyond Scotland and Portugal, the story begins to face west. This is where the sea changes its meaning. So far, the vanished fleet has moved through places we can understand in ordinary political terms. Scotland offered conflict and distance. Portugal offered legal transformation. Both are plausible destinations because they belonged to the known world of medieval power. Kingdoms, rulers, ports, institutions, bargains. The Atlantic is different. To send the fleet westward is to move the story out of the archive and into fog. Not because medieval sailors were incapable of courage or long-distance navigation, but because the evidence becomes thinner, the claims become larger, and the line between possibility and invention begins to blur. The Atlantic escape theory usually begins with a simple idea. If the ships left La Rochelle and did not appear neatly in the expected records. Perhaps they sailed beyond the familiar routes altogether. Not north to Scotland, not south to Portugal, west, into waters that later generations would associate with discovery, secrecy, and lost worlds. It is a thrilling thought. It is also a dangerous one, because once the ships cross into the open Atlantic, the story becomes almost too easy to enlarge. A missing fleet can become an expedition. An expedition can become pre-Columbian contact. Pre-Columbian contact can become hidden maps, carved symbols, buried relics, and a secret tradition passed through generations. The further the ships sail from documentation, the more cargo imagination loads onto them. That does not mean the Atlantic theory should be mocked out of existence. Medieval Atlantic travel was not impossible. Mariners knew routes along the coast. Islands in the Atlantic were not purely mythical in the medieval imagination. Sailors, traders, fishermen, and adventurers often moved with more practical knowledge than formal chronicles preserved. The sea has always contained unofficial experience, routes learned by use, not always written down for royal clerks. But there is a difference between sailing beyond the immediate reach of France and crossing into world-altering discovery. That difference matters. A fleet escaping west could mean several things. It could mean moving temporarily into Atlantic waters to avoid seizure, then turning toward another destination. It could mean sailing to islands, anchorages, or friendly ports not immediately obvious to royal officials. It could mean dispersal, with ships taking different routes to reduce the risk of capture. These are practical possibilities. Then there is the larger claim, that the Templars crossed the ocean and reached lands unknown to official European history before Columbus. That claim is much harder to support. Here, the evidence is not just thin. It often arrives in fragments that need careful handling. Alleged symbols, later traditions, speculative maps, architectural comparisons, and stories that appear long after the events they claim to describe. Some of these may be interesting. Some may preserve local memory. Some may be misread, misdated, or simply overinterpreted by people eager to find the Templars, wherever a mystery is waiting. The word belongs firmly over this part of the map. Still, the Atlantic theory reveals something important about the Templar legend. It shows how the missing fleet became a vessel for questions much larger than the order itself. The Templars were not only imagined as fugitives from Philip IV. They became, in later storytelling, guardians of knowledge that official history supposedly failed to recognize. Their ships did not merely escape a king. They escaped the boundaries of the known story. That is why the theory has such lasting appeal. It takes a documented catastrophe, the arrests of 1307, and connects it to one of the great imaginative frontiers of European history, the ocean before Columbus. The result feels almost irresistible. A powerful order falls, its fleet vanishes, a secret voyage begins. Centuries later, official discovery catches up to what the initiated already knew. It is elegant, too elegant perhaps. Real history tends to be less symmetrical. Events do not usually arrange themselves into perfect hidden prologues for later milestones. The fact that Portugal later became central to Atlantic exploration does not prove that Templar ships had already crossed the ocean. The fact that the Templars had ships does not prove they possessed the knowledge, motive, or capacity for a transatlantic mission. The fact that records are missing does not give us permission to write whatever we like in the blank space. The blank space is not ours to conquer. It is ours to examine. If we treat the Atlantic escape theory cautiously, its most reasonable version is not a secret discovery of the Americas. It is flight through maritime uncertainty. Ships under threat may have used the Atlantic as cover. Distance, weather, dispersed routes, and the sheer difficulty of tracking vessels once they left port. A ship did not need to cross an ocean to vanish from a king's grasp. It only needed to move beyond the reach of his men and his paperwork. That may sound less dramatic, but it is historically powerful. In 1307, control was strongest where officials could arrive, inspect, arrest, and inventory. The sea weakened that control. A royal order could move swiftly across land through appointed agents. It could not move with the same certainty across water. Winds disobeyed kings. Crews had loyalties of their own. Ports could deny knowledge. Captains could change course. A cargo could be relabeled, divided, or unloaded before anyone with authority asked the right question. The Atlantic did not need to be unknown to be useful. It needed to be hard to police. That is the heart of the matter. The mystery of La Rochelle may not require a voyage to the New World. The ocean itself was enough. It created delay. It created ambiguity. It created plausible deniability. Once ships left the harbor, every mile of water widened the gap between event and evidence. And yet, the larger dream remains. Some people continue to look at the vanished fleet and imagine sails moving west across an empty horizon, carrying maps no one else possessed, or knowledge inherited from older navigators, or ambitions too dangerous to declare. The image is not supported by firm evidence, but it persists because it gives the Templars a future beyond defeat. It turns them from victims of royal power into authors of an unrecorded age of exploration. That transformation is emotionally satisfying. It may also be misleading. The more careful interpretation is to see the Atlantic not as proof of a secret discovery, but as the perfect environment for uncertainty to survive. The sea destroys paper trails. It scatters witnesses. It absorbs wrecks, cargo, and human intention without explanation. A ship can leave with a destination and never reach it. It can reach a destination and leave no record we can verify. It can be renamed, sold, hidden, or broken apart. It can become part of another fleet so completely that its former identity disappears. This is how the Atlantic enters the story, not as a confirmed road to America, but as a machine for erasing certainty. That is enough to keep the question alive. If the Templar fleet sailed west, we cannot say with confidence how far it went. We cannot identify its ports of call. We cannot prove that it carried treasure, archives, relics, or men tasked with preserving a forbidden mission. We can only say that the idea grows from a real historical tension. A powerful order faced sudden destruction, and ships associated with its maritime world seemed to slip beyond the clean grasp of the record. From there, legend takes the helm. It steers boldly. Historians, unfortunately for the legend, have to keep checking the weather. So we remain suspended between two versions of the Westward Sea. In one, the fleet uses the Atlantic practically as a shield against seizure and pursuit. In the other, it becomes a secret expedition into lands that official history had not yet named for Europe. The first is plausible but hard to document. The second is fascinating but deeply, and perhaps that is why the Atlantic theory endures. It offers not an answer, but a horizon, a place where the eye can travel farther than the evidence, and where the missing ships can keep sailing long after the archive falls silent. The New World hypothesis is where the Templar story leaves the shore of cautious speculation and steps onto much thinner ice. It is not enough, in this version, that the fleet escaped France. It is not enough that ships may have scattered through the Atlantic, or that some assets may have moved toward safer kingdoms. The claim here is larger, that the Templars, or men connected to them, reached the Americas before Columbus, leaving traces that official history either missed, misunderstood, or chose not to recognize. It is a claim with enormous appetite. It wants ships, maps, symbols, monuments, hidden continuity, and a secret memory stretching across centuries. It wants the fall of the Order in 1307 to become the first act of an undisclosed age of exploration. It wants the empty berths of La Rochelle to point not merely away from France, but across the ocean. And that is precisely why we have to be careful. The evidence usually offered for this hypothesis tends to fall into suggestive categories rather than solid proof. There are alleged carvings and symbols said to resemble Templar crosses. There are architectural parallels that some interpret as signs of hidden influence. There are stories about mysterious visitors, unusual markings, or maritime knowledge appearing earlier than expected. There are claims that later explorers inherited maps or navigational traditions from older secret networks. Some of these ideas are intriguing. Many need verification, and several depend on a method that can be dangerously flexible. Find a symbol that resembles another symbol, place them beside each other, and let resemblance do the work of evidence. Resemblance can start a question. It cannot finish one. A cross carved in stone is not automatically a Templar signature. Crosses were everywhere in medieval Christian culture, appearing in countless forms, contexts, and local traditions. A geometric design may look meaningful to modern eyes because we are searching for meaning. An architectural similarity may result from shared techniques, later reconstruction, coincidence, or simple misdating. A symbol becomes evidence only when it can be placed securely in time, place, and context. Without that, it remains a spark. And sparks can illuminate, or they can start fires in rooms full of dry imagination. This is not said to ridicule curiosity. Curiosity is the only reason this investigation exists at all. The problem is that the Templars have become one of history's favorite containers for unsolved things. When an object is unexplained, someone eventually asks whether the Templars were involved. When a symbol is ambiguous, someone notices a cross. When a voyage seems possible but undocumented, someone supplies a fleet. The Order becomes a convenient bridge between mystery and conclusion. But a bridge must rest on something. The New World hypothesis often rests on scattered claims that are difficult to connect directly to 1307, to La Rochelle, or to identifiable Templar personnel. That does not mean every claim is worthless. It means each one has to be tested alone before being woven into a grand pattern. Is the object authentic? Is the date secure? Is the location clearly documented? Could the symbol have another explanation? Does the claim appear in contemporary records or only in much later retellings? Are we looking at evidence or at an interpretation that has become more confident with every repetition? These questions are not designed to kill the mystery. They are designed to keep it honest. Because the most tempting version of the New World theory is also the weakest. The idea of a single hidden chain running from the Templar fleet at La Rochelle to pre-Columbian America, then onward into later exploration and secret societies. It is a beautiful narrative machine. Everything fits. Every gap becomes a passageway. Every silence becomes concealment. The trouble is that history rarely gives us machines that elegant. It gives us fragments. One fragment may suggest that medieval sailors understood more of the Atlantic than official court chronicles reveal. Another may show that later Europeans were fascinated by rumors of Western lands. Another may show that symbols traveled, changed, and reappeared in unexpected places. But fragments are not automatically parts of the same vessel. Sometimes they are driftwood from different wrecks. The stronger way to approach the hypothesis is not to ask, did the Templars discover America? That question is too large, too loaded, and too easily answered by desire. A better question is smaller. What would have been required for the vanished fleet to cross the Atlantic? And what evidence would we expect if it did? We would expect traces of navigation, not just legend. We would expect some credible record of destination, cargo, survivors, or contact. We might expect material evidence that can be securely dated and linked to European visitors of that period. We would expect more than symbolic resemblance. We would expect the chain to hold under pressure. At present, that chain needs verification. And yet, the hypothesis persists because it gives the Templars a strange dignity after defeat. In the official story, the order is arrested, tortured, discredited, dissolved, and absorbed into other structures. In the New World version, the order does not merely survive. It outruns its enemies so completely that it steps beyond the known map. That is powerful storytelling. It also tells us something about the modern imagination. We are uncomfortable with the idea that a wealthy, disciplined, international order could be destroyed by paperwork, prison cells, and political will. We want a counterstroke. We want escape to become destiny. We want the ships to carry not only men and goods, but revenge against the limits of official history. The ocean becomes a kind of moral compensation. France condemns them. The Atlantic frees them. The Americas receive them. It is almost too satisfying. The more sober view is less grand, but more useful. It acknowledges that the Templars had maritime connections, that La Rochelle was an important Atlantic port, and that the disappearance of ships from the expected record creates a genuine historical puzzle. It also acknowledges that claims of American contact require evidence of a much higher standard than rumor, resemblance, or later enthusiasm. Extraordinary distance demands extraordinary clarity. Without it, we are not studying a voyage. We are studying a dream of a voyage. That dream has a history of its own. It belongs to a long tradition of looking for hidden Europeans in places where the record does not plainly put them, of turning ambiguous marks into secret messages, and of imagining that official discovery was merely the public version of an older private truth. Sometimes such questions can lead to real research. Sometimes they lead only to elegant myths with footnotes attached. The danger is not believing that lost voyages may have happened. Lost voyages almost certainly did happen across human history. Ships disappear, sailors drift. Contacts occur without becoming official. The danger is assigning those possibilities to the Templars, because they are famous enough to make the story feel important. Fame is not evidence. So we leave the New World hypothesis in its proper condition, fascinating, unstable, and unproven. It is not impossible in the broadest sense that medieval Europeans crossed farther west than surviving records clearly show. It is not impossible that fugitives from a shattered order took routes we can no longer reconstruct. But the specific claim that the La Rochelle fleet reached the Americas, carried Templar secrets there, and left identifiable traces remains firmly in the realm of speculation. The mystery does not collapse without it. In fact, it may become sharper. Because once we remove the grandest claim, we can see the real question again. Not whether the Templars secretly rewrote the history of the Atlantic world, but whether their ships, at a moment of danger, moved beyond the grasp of the men sent to destroy them. That is already enough. A missing fleet does not need to discover a continent to matter. It only needs to vanish at the exact moment history wanted it counted. The idea of hidden archives is less colorful than gold, and for that reason it may be closer to the nerve of the story. Gold is simple. Anyone can understand why a king would want it, why a fugitive would hide it, why a legend would polish it until it shines brighter than the evidence. Archives are different. They do not gleam. They do not announce themselves. They sit in bundles, chests, cupboards, and strong rooms depending entirely on people who know what they mean. But in 1307, knowledge could be a form of power that coin alone could not replace. If something was removed from La Rochelle before the arrests, it may have been money. It may have been valuables. It may have been personnel. Yet the most consequential cargo might have been records, financial instruments, correspondence, property titles, lists of deposits, letters of privilege, internal communications, and perhaps documents whose importance only became clear once the order was under attack. This is where the Templar mystery becomes more intelligent than the treasure hunt. The order had operated across borders for nearly 2 centuries. It had served pilgrims, fought wars, managed estates, moved funds, and maintained relationships with kings, nobles, clergy, merchants, and other religious houses. Such an institution does not survive by memory alone. It produces records. It depends on records. It trains men to respect seals, dates, obligations, and permissions. A knight may win a battle. A clerk may preserve the reason the land still belongs to you afterward. That is not a glamorous sentence, but medieval power often lived in sentences like it. The hidden archives theory asks whether the Templars, facing royal seizure, moved certain documents beyond reach, not necessarily because those documents contained an explosive theological secret, though that is the version popular imagination prefers. The more grounded possibility is administrative and political. Records that could protect assets, expose debts, identify allies, or preserve the order's internal structure if some form of survival became possible elsewhere. In other words, an archive might not have threatened the church because it contained forbidden scripture. It might have threatened powerful men because it contained receipts. That kind of danger is easier to underestimate. A sacred scandal makes a better poster, but a financial record can be devastating in a world built on obligation. If a monarch owed money, if nobles had deposited funds, if revenues had been pledged, if property claims depended on Templar documentation, then the loss or survival of records mattered deeply. The collapse of an institution is often followed by a battle over paper. Who owns this land now? Who receives this income? Who repays this debt? Who has the right to speak for the dead organization? Without documents, answers become easier for the victorious to invent. This is one reason an archive could have been worth saving. Not because it revealed the end of the world, but because it prevented the winners from writing the entire ending alone. Of course, the more sensational theory goes further. It imagines the Templars holding religious documents dangerous to church authority, alternative accounts of sacred history, suppressed teachings, controversial texts, or evidence of beliefs that would have embarrassed Rome. These claims appear often in later Templar lore, and they have a powerful narrative pull. A military order accused of heresy, destroyed by king and pope, secretly preserving forbidden truth. The structure is almost irresistible, but evidence must interrupt desire. There is no secure proof that the La Rochelle fleet carried documents capable of overturning Christian doctrine. There is no confirmed secret library whose contents can be tied to the missing ships. The accusations made against the Templars during the trials were severe, but the trial process itself was shaped by pressure, coercion, politics, and fear. To leap from accusations of heresy to a hidden archive of world-changing religious truth is to cross a bridge built mostly from atmosphere. The evidence is thinner here. Still, we should not dismiss the possibility of sensitive writings altogether. Religious orders produced and preserved correspondence. They maintained rules, privileges, legal records, devotional materials, and communications with church authorities. Some documents may have been embarrassing, politically awkward, or useful in defense. Others may have been valuable simply because they proved continuity at a time when enemies wanted discontinuity. A hidden archive does not need to be heretical to be dangerous. It only needs to be inconvenient. That word may be the key. Inconvenient to Philip. If records revealed financial entanglements or challenged royal claims to seized property, Inconvenient to local officials if documents complicated inventories. Inconvenient to church authorities if trial narratives looked less clean beside internal correspondence. Inconvenient to anyone who benefited from reducing a complex institution to a set of charges and a pile of confiscated assets. History is often tidied by those with power. Archives resist tidiness. They preserve contradictions. They remember favors. They keep old promises alive long after the people who made them would prefer silence. They reveal that institutions are not symbols, but systems, full of accounts, exceptions, permissions, debts, and compromises. If the Templars had time to protect anything, they may have protected that memory. But here again, caution matters. We do not possess a confirmed inventory of what was placed aboard the missing ships. We cannot name a chest and say, inside it were the central archives of the order. The phrase, hidden archives, is useful only if we keep it disciplined. It points toward a category of plausible value, not a proven cargo. What can be said is this: for an organization under sudden attack, records would matter. For an order with financial reach, records would matter greatly. For survivors trying to defend property, reputation, or future legitimacy, records might matter more than silver. And La Rochelle, if it offered a way out, would have been an ideal place to move them. Documents are portable. They can be sealed against weather, divided among trusted men, hidden inside ordinary cargo, or carried by clerks who look far less interesting than armed knights. A chest of papers might pass through a harbor with no drama at all. No crowd would gasp. No chronicler would necessarily notice. A dock worker might see only another box among many. That is what makes the archive theory compelling. It is not loud. It does not require a supernatural relic or a secret map to paradise. It requires only an endangered institution, a port, a warning, and the understanding that the future belongs partly to whoever preserves the records. There is also a darker possibility. Perhaps some documents were not saved. Perhaps they were destroyed. If capture seemed likely, burning sensitive records could have been safer than letting them fall into royal hands. In that case, the missing archive is not hidden in a vault or carried across the sea. It is ash, gone not because it was lost, but because someone decided that oblivion was safer than possession. That possibility rarely appears in romantic versions of the story. A burned archive gives treasure hunters nothing to find, but it may be historically more plausible than a perfect secret library surviving intact for centuries. The truth may be divided. Some records seized, some lost, some destroyed, some moved, some absorbed into other institutions under new names, especially in places where Templar property or personnel were transferred rather than obliterated. The archive, if we can even call it that, may not have survived as one hidden collection. It may have scattered like the order itself. A ledger in one kingdom, a charter in another, a memory carried by a clerk who knew which noble owed what, a sealed privilege preserved because someone understood that legality could outlive disgrace. This scattered survival would be harder to find, but more believable than the grand vault of legend, and perhaps that is why the hidden archives remain so haunting. They represent not only what the Templars may have known, but what we no longer know about them. The missing ships become a symbol of missing context. Without the full records, the order is too easily flattened into extremes. Holy warriors or heretics, bankers or victims, secret masters or tragic scapegoats. Archives would complicate all of that. They would show the daily machinery behind the myth. They might disappoint anyone looking for forbidden revelations. They might reveal something more human. Bills, favors, disputes, repairs, routes, payments, instructions, anxieties, and the ordinary handwriting of an extraordinary institution trying to function in a dangerous world. That may be the secret history worth wanting. Not a single document that explains everything. A collection of documents that refuses to let the story become simple. So if La Rochelle's ships carried papers into the Atlantic, the loss is not merely material, it is interpretive. It means part of the order's own voice may have sailed out of reach before its enemies began speaking on its behalf. And when an institution is destroyed, that is often the final victory. Not the prison, not the confiscation. The silence afterward. The Vatican's silence is one of the easiest parts of the story to misunderstand. Silence feels intentional. It feels like a door held shut. When records are missing, when answers are incomplete, when a powerful institution stands near the center of a mystery, the imagination naturally reaches for suppression. It is almost a reflex. If the Church does not tell us exactly what happened to the fleet, perhaps the Church knew. If the documents are absent, perhaps someone removed them. If the archive does not speak, perhaps it was ordered not to. That possibility cannot be dismissed entirely, but it also cannot be treated as proof. The Church in the early 14th century was not a single mind quietly arranging every detail from a hidden chamber. It was a vast, political, legal, spiritual, and administrative world, filled with competing interests, personalities, offices, pressures, and limitations. It could preserve documents with astonishing care in one matter and lose the thread completely in another. It could act deliberately, hesitate publicly, compromise privately, and later leave behind records that are detailed in some places and maddeningly thin in others. So when we speak of Vatican silence, we have to ask what kind of silence we mean. There is the silence of concealment. There is the silence of loss. There is the silence of documents never created. There is the silence of records that once existed but were damaged, scattered, misfiled, neglected, or absorbed into collections where their meaning changed. And then there is the silence created when later generations ask questions that medieval officials were not trying to answer. That last one matters. A modern viewer wants to know where the ships went. A royal official in 1307 may have cared more about arrests, confessions, property seizure, legal procedure, and political obedience. A church investigator may have focused on the order's alleged crimes, its rule, its leaders, and its relationship to papal authority. A missing maritime inventory may not have been treated as the central mystery at all. It may have been a practical nuisance, a financial concern, or simply one uncertainty among many during a messy institutional collapse. History does not always preserve the thing we later decide is important. The suppression of the Templars was not clean. It involved royal pressure, papal hesitation, accusations, interrogations, councils, and the gradual transfer or redistribution of assets. The Church's role was complicated because the Templars were a papal order. In theory, they belonged under papal authority, not the direct authority of the French king. Philip's attack therefore created not only a legal crisis, but an embarrassment. A king had moved first. The Church had to respond. That imbalance may help explain why the surviving record can feel so unsatisfying. The official process needed to address guilt, discipline, property, and institutional fate. It did not necessarily need to preserve, for our benefit, every rumor of ships leaving La Rochelle. If the fleet had already gone, and if no one could easily seize it, the official machinery may have concentrated on what could still be controlled. Prisons could be controlled. Buildings could be controlled. Confessions could be extracted, shaped, copied, and debated. The sea could not. There is also a darker interpretation. If church authorities knew or suspected that certain Templar assets had escaped, they may have had reasons not to dwell on it, publicly acknowledging that ships, wealth, or records slipped away before the arrests could have weakened the image of orderly suppression. It could have suggested warning, incompetence, complicity, or division. None of these would have been useful to men trying to close a scandal with dignity and tact. Institutions do not always lie. Sometimes they simply choose the version of events that creates the least additional trouble. That kind of suppression is rarely theatrical. It does not require a dramatic order to burn every page. It can happen through emphasis, through omission, through deciding that a question is inconvenient, secondary, or better left unresolved. A clerk records the property taken, not the property missing. A legal report focuses on doctrine, not ships. A political compromise avoids reopening matters that would embarrass everyone involved. The result, centuries later, looks like a locked vault. It may have begun as avoidance. This is why conspiracy theories gather so easily around the Templars. The official story itself contains enough pressure, coercion, and political interest to make distrust reasonable. Philip IV benefited from destroying the order. The charges were severe and often grotesque. Testimony was extracted under conditions that make modern readers deeply cautious. The Pope did not act in a vacuum. Power leaned heavily on the scales. So when people suspect that something was hidden, they are not starting from nothing. They are responding to a real atmosphere of manipulation. But the danger is moving too quickly from the process was politically compromised to therefore every missing detail was deliberately suppressed. That leap feels satisfying, but it is not careful. Medieval record survival is uneven even when no one is hiding anything. Wars, fires, damp, insects, careless storage, changing administrative needs, and simple human disinterest have destroyed more evidence than most conspiracies ever could. The past is not silent only because someone silenced it. Sometimes it is silent because parchment is mortal. Still, the Vatican's role remains important for another reason. The Church had the authority to define what the Templars became in memory. Once the order was suppressed, its reputation passed into the hands of judges, clerics, chroniclers, enemies, defenders, and later writers who worked with incomplete materials. The Templars could no longer speak as a unified institution. Their archives, if scattered or seized, no longer defended them in one voice. That is a profound shift. An institution with its own records can argue. An institution without them becomes an object of argument. This may be the deeper meaning of the Church's silence. Not necessarily that Rome hid the fleet. Not necessarily that forbidden documents sleep under lock and key, but that the official process failed to leave us a full account of what disappeared, what survived, and what was quietly redirected. In that failure, whether accidental or convenient, the legend found room to grow. And legends love institutional silence. They do not need much: a missing inventory, a vague reference, a destroyed archive, a powerful authority with something to lose. From those ingredients, centuries of speculation can be made. The Vatican, because it represents continuity and secrecy in the popular imagination, becomes the perfect wall onto which every unanswered Templar question can be projected. But a wall is not always a confession. Sometimes it is only a wall. The more responsible approach is to separate what the silence might mean from what we wish it meant. It might mean that records of the fleet were lost. It might mean that they were never central enough to preserve. It might mean that officials knew less than later theorists assume. It might mean that some information was deliberately minimized because it complicated the official settlement. It might even mean that certain documents remain somewhere, uncatalogued or misunderstood, not as part of a grand cover-up, but because archives are vast and history is untidy. That last possibility is almost more frustrating than conspiracy. A secret locked away by design has a villain. A document lost in cataloging has only bureaucracy. And bureaucracy is harder to turn into legend, though it has probably defeated more researchers than any secret society ever managed. When we return to La Rochelle, the Vatican's silence does not give us an answer. It gives us a condition. The official record is incomplete, and that incompleteness has consequences. It forces us to work with shadows of administration rather than clear testimony. It reminds us that power decides not only who is punished, but which questions are preserved. If the fleet vanished, the silence around it may have been useful to many people. Useful to Philip, if escaped assets made his victory look less total. Useful to church authorities, if the matter complicated an already delicate suppression. Useful to local officials, if missing goods reflected poorly on their diligence. Useful to survivors, if silence protected routes, names, or cargo. A mystery can survive when several different interests prefer not to illuminate it. That may be the most realistic form of secrecy in this story. Not one master conspiracy, a convergence of convenience. Everyone had reasons to look elsewhere. The king wanted control. The church wanted resolution. Local officers wanted obedience. Survivors wanted distance. Later institutions wanted stable inheritance. And somewhere inside that crowded field of motives, the ships of La Rochelle became less a matter of record than a matter of rumor. So the Vatican's silence remains haunting, but not because it proves hidden truth. It haunts because it shows how easily truth can become unrecoverable when authority, embarrassment, and time all pull in the same direction. The fleet did not need to be erased by a single hand. It only needed to pass into a place where no powerful institution had a strong reason to describe it clearly. And once that happened, the silence became part of the story. Not empty, not conclusive, but heavy enough that 7 centuries later, we are still listening to it. Pirate legends attach themselves to the Templars almost too easily. Both live in the imagination at the edge of lawful power. Both move across water. Both are surrounded by stories of hidden treasure, secret loyalties, strange symbols, coded signs, and men who operated outside the ordinary reach of kings. Place a missing Templar fleet beside the later world of Atlantic piracy, and the mind begins drawing lines before the evidence has put on its boots. The connection is tempting. It is also treacherous. The first problem is time. The golden age of Atlantic piracy belongs to a much later world than 1307, a world of colonial empires, transoceanic trade, privateering, naval warfare, and vast flows of silver, sugar, enslaved labor, and imperial wealth. The Knights Templar belonged to the medieval crusading world, with its own structures, laws, vows, and economies. To link them too directly is to stretch a rope across centuries and pretend it is a bridge. But the more interesting question is not whether pirates were secretly Templars. That claim is far too broad and far too loose. The better question is whether maritime knowledge, habits, or displaced personnel from the Templar world could have flowed into later seafaring traditions in ways that became impossible to trace. And even there, we have to move carefully. The Templars did maintain maritime connections. They needed ships for transport, supply, communication, and the movement of people and goods across crusading and European networks. They were not simply men on horseback. Their world included ports, sailors, cargo, contracts, and routes. If ships connected to the order left La Rochelle before the arrests, then sailors, captains, or maritime agents connected to those ships may have continued their lives elsewhere. A sailor does not vanish because the institution that paid him collapses. He finds another employer. That is the practical doorway through which a modest version of the pirate connection enters. Not as a secret Templar navy reborn under the black flag, not as a sacred brotherhood turning into sea raiders, but as skills surviving outside their original structure: navigation, provisioning, coastal intelligence, ship maintenance, evasion, informal alliances, and the art of moving valuable cargo without inviting questions. These were not uniquely Templar skills, they were maritime skills. That distinction matters. If a later pirate used knowledge of a harbor, a tide, a concealed anchorage, or a trade route, we should not leap to a medieval order for explanation. Sailors learned from sailors. Ports were schools without classrooms. Knowledge moved in taverns, docks, shipyards, fishing communities, merchant houses, and naval service. It was passed through work, not always through written instruction. So if Templar maritime knowledge influenced later groups, it would likely have done so indirectly, diluted through generations, absorbed into the broader culture of the sea until it no longer carried a name. That kind of influence is almost impossible to prove. It is also more plausible than the dramatic version. The dramatic version imagines a hidden Templar naval tradition, surviving intact, later resurfacing in pirate symbolism or secret societies of the sea. The evidence for that is thin. Pirate flags, for example, developed in their own later context of intimidation, identity, and psychological warfare. Skulls, bones, hourglasses, weapons, and dark banners were meant to send immediate messages to ships about violence, surrender, and fear. To read them automatically as Templar inheritance is to mistake resemblance for lineage. Again, resemblance can start a question. It cannot finish one. The same caution applies to treasure legends. Pirates buried far less treasure than fiction suggests, and Templar treasure has been inflated by the same imaginative habit. When the two traditions merge, the result is almost irresistible. A vanished fleet becomes the ancestor of hidden pirate hordes, secret maps and maritime brotherhoods guarding relics under false names. It is great entertainment. It is poor evidence. But legends are not useless simply because they are unreliable. They reveal what people wanted the past to mean. In later centuries, pirates became symbols of rebellion against empire, law, and hierarchy, even when real piracy was often brutal, desperate, and economically opportunistic. The Templars, after their destruction, became symbols of persecuted power. Men accused, dispossessed, and possibly carrying secrets beyond the reach of those who condemned them. Bring those two images together, and you get a powerful myth of outlaw continuity. The idea that something defeated on land survived at sea. The sea is important here. It has always made authority nervous. On land, power builds walls, courts, prisons, and tax offices. At sea, power must chase. It must patrol. It must depend on weather, crews, and distance. A ship can change its flag, alter its name, hide in a cove, join a convoy, or become someone else's property with a few strokes of ink and enough people willing not to ask too many questions. For a story like the vanished Templar fleet, the maritime world offers the perfect afterlife. Ships can become rumors, crews can scatter, cargo can be divided, identities can soften. A disciplined order can dissolve into practical seamanship, and practical seamanship can later be mistaken for secret tradition. That may be the real link between the Templars and pirate legend, not a bloodline, but a shared landscape of ambiguity. Both stories live in gaps between law and movement. Both involve wealth that authority wants to seize or control. Both become larger in memory because the sea refuses to keep neat records for us. There is also the matter of moral inversion. The Templars were once sanctioned warriors of the Church, men whose violence was wrapped in vows and permissions. Pirates were criminals in the eyes of states, though some began as privateers operating with legal cover until politics changed. The difference between lawful violence and unlawful violence could depend on who issued the document and whether that document still mattered. A royal commission could make a raider useful. A political reversal could make him a criminal. A papal privilege could protect an order. A royal accusation could destroy it. In that sense, the Templar collapse and later pirate culture both expose the fragility of legal identity. A man's status could change faster than his skills. Yesterday's servant of Christendom could become today's suspect. Yesterday's privateer could become tomorrow's pirate. The sea did not erase these distinctions, but it made them easier to blur. That is fertile ground for legend. Still, we should not confuse atmosphere with ancestry. There is no solid evidence that Templar sailors founded pirate communities, created pirate codes, or preserved a secret maritime order that later emerged in the Atlantic. The chronology is strained, the documentation is lacking, and the claims often depend on symbols, rumors, or the simple appeal of connecting two famous mysteries. The stronger conclusion is more restrained. The Templars had ships and maritime experience. The destruction of the order may have displaced sailors, agents, and knowledge into other networks. Some of that knowledge may have continued anonymously in the wider maritime world. Later pirate legends, already rich with treasure and secrecy, found in the Templars a ready-made ancestor. The connection, therefore, is cultural more than historical, a fusion of two traditions that both thrive where documentation fades and imagination gets generous. And yet, there is a reason the idea will not quite leave us. If ships did escape from La Rochelle, they entered the same unstable world that later made pirates possible. Ports with divided loyalties, captains who served whoever paid, officials who could be bribed, cargoes that changed hands and waters where pursuit became uncertain. The missing fleet did not need to become pirate in any later sense. It only needed to enter the older, rougher truth behind all maritime legend, that the sea can protect the wanted, hide the valuable, and turn identity into something negotiable. That is enough to cast a long shadow, not a black flag, not a secret order of sea raiders, a continuity of conditions. The same ocean that could swallow a Templar vessel in 1307 could shelter a smuggler, a privateer, or a pirate centuries later. The names changed, the politics changed, the ships changed, but the basic problem remained. Once a vessel left the harbor, authority became a matter of distance, weather, and who controlled the next port. Perhaps that is why pirate legends found the Templars so useful. They gave the outlaw sea a deeper past, and they gave the vanished fleet a future noisy enough to be remembered, even if it was never proven. By now, the missing fleet has collected many possible destinations. Scotland gives it refuge. Portugal gives it transformation. The Atlantic gives it distance. The New World gives it myth. Pirate legend gives it a strange afterlife among later maritime shadows. But there is a colder question beneath all of those possibilities. What actually happens to ships? Not symbols, not legends. Ships. Wooden vessels do not remain mysterious forever simply because a story needs them to. They rot. They are sold. They are renamed. They are repaired until little of the original timber remains. They are wrecked on coasts whose witnesses leave no record. They are broken apart for useful planks, absorbed into another fleet, seized by a different authority, or quietly abandoned when maintenance costs more than the hull is worth. A medieval ship was not a monument. It was a working object, and working objects have hard lives. This matters because one of the great traps in the vanished fleet story is the assumption that disappearance means preservation. We imagine the ships still somewhere, hidden, intact, waiting in a secret harbor like evidence that has been politely holding its breath for 700 years. But the practical fate of any fleet is usually less romantic. Ships survive by being used, and use destroys them. Salt eats, weather opens seams, worms bore into timber, ropes fail, sails tear, iron corrodes, men improvise repairs. A vessel changes shape across years of service until its identity becomes more legal than physical. The name may remain, or it may not. The owner may change. The purpose may change. At some point, the ship that left La Rochelle, if it left, may no longer have been recognizable even to the men who first crewed it. That is not a satisfying ending. It is a likely one. If the Templar vessels were not captured in France, several practical outcomes are possible. They may have entered the service of another ruler or institution. They may have been sold through intermediaries to disguise their origin. They may have been divided among ports, with crews instructed to scatter rather than remain together as a conspicuous group. They may have continued ordinary trade under new ownership. They may have carried cargo once, delivered it, and then vanished into the usual churn of maritime life. A fleet does not have to be hidden in order to disappear. It only has to stop being called by its old name. That point is worth lingering over. The Templar identity was dangerous after 1307. A ship openly known as a Templar vessel would attract legal and political attention. But a ship under another owner, in another port, with a different crew list or a changed function, could become almost impossible to trace. The transformation would not require a grand ritual of secrecy. It would require paperwork, opportunity, and silence. Again, paperwork. The least glamorous accomplice in half of history's mysteries. Consider a vessel sold to a merchant. Its cargo is removed. Its markings, if any, are altered. Its captain takes new employment. The men aboard scatter to other ships. A royal official later asks about Templar property, and the answer comes back incomplete, delayed, or carefully unhelpful. Years pass. The ship is repaired, renamed, or wrecked. By the time anyone tries to reconstruct the trail, there is no fleet left to find, only a sequence of transactions that may never have been recorded in the words we need. Another possibility is absorption into other navies or maritime orders. Portugal, Aragon, England, or smaller authorities with maritime interests could all have found ships useful. A vessel is valuable, especially when kingdoms and ports depend on transport, supply, and war at sea. If former Templar assets reached a ruler willing to protect or repurpose them, the ships may have become ordinary instruments of policy. That would be survival of a sort, but it would not look like survival in legend. The fleet would not remain a fleet. It would dissolve into usefulness. There is also the possibility of destruction. Not dramatic destruction, necessarily. No need for a burning horizon. No last stand against royal galleys. A ship fleeing danger might wreck in bad weather. It might be deliberately scuttled if capture seemed near. It might be broken down after delivering sensitive cargo, because a destroyed vessel cannot testify. It might be stripped for timber in a port where wood itself had value. In the medieval world, even endings were recycled. A plank from a Templar ship, if such a thing existed, might have become part of a dock, a warehouse repair, a fishing boat, a gate, a roof beam. Evidence does not always vanish by being hidden. Sometimes it vanishes by becoming useful in smaller pieces. That image is less grand than treasure beneath a chapel floor. But it has a stubborn realism. A ship is not only a carrier of mystery. It is material. Men use material. So when we ask why no one has found the fleet, we may be asking the wrong question. The fleet may not exist as something findable. Not because it sailed beyond the edge of the world, but because the physical objects themselves entered the ordinary cycle of maritime decay, repair, resale, and loss. The more we reduce the legend to practical choices, the more plausible the disappearance becomes. If you were responsible for protecting Templar ships after the arrests, what would you do? Keeping them together would be dangerous. Keeping their identity visible would be foolish. Sailing them into a famous port under known command would invite seizure. The safer strategy would be dispersal. Break the pattern. Change names. Move cargo separately. Place men where they could survive. Convert assets into forms that cannot be easily identified as Templar. In other words, make the fleet stop looking like a fleet. That may be the most effective answer to Philip's reach. A king can seize a commandery. He can inventory a treasury. He can interrogate a prisoner. But he cannot easily confiscate what has already been transformed into several ships, under several names, in several jurisdictions, carrying cargo that no longer announces its origin. Of course, this remains hypothetical. We do not have the neat documents we would need to track each vessel. We cannot stand at La Rochelle with a list and follow every hull to its fate. The record does not permit that. And because it does not, the story has repeatedly invited more spectacular explanations. But the logistical explanation has its own quiet force. The fleet may have vanished because it was successfully broken apart, not destroyed in a single event, not hidden in a cavern, not preserved by a secret order of descendants, simply dispersed into the working sea. This possibility also explains why later stories could grow so large. When a fleet leaves no final wreck, no captured manifest, no public sale, no royal display of triumph, people assume the ending must be extraordinary. But sometimes the absence of an ending is the ending. The ships went on being ships until they could not. There is something almost frustratingly humble about that. And yet, it fits the world. Medieval power was local, negotiated, and uneven. Ports had interests. Merchants had appetites. Rulers had priorities. Crews had wages to earn. A ship with a useful hull could be more valuable alive under a new name than dead as proof in an old scandal. If former Templar vessels entered that world, they may have been swallowed not by mystery, but by economy. The sea did not need to hide them forever. The market could help. So the fate of the ships may lie somewhere between myth and inventory. Some may have sailed away with valuable cargo. Some may have been sold. Some may have served new masters. Some may have wrecked. Some may have been stripped. Some may have carried men who never again called themselves Templars in public. The fleet, as a single dramatic entity, may have survived only briefly after leaving the harbor. Then it fragmented. This is less romantic than a hidden armada waiting beneath history's surface. But it may be closer to how institutions actually die. They do not always vanish in one glorious motion. They are liquidated, renamed, reassigned, repurposed, and forgotten in pieces. And if that happened to the ships of La Rochelle, then their disappearance was not a miracle. It was administration meeting seawater. A set of vessels became assets. Assets became transactions. Transactions became vague memories. Memories became legend. And legend, being much harder to sink than timber, kept sailing. At this point, the story needs a table, not a treasure map. That may sound disappointing, but it is the only fair way to handle a mystery that has spent centuries attracting beautiful exaggerations. The vanished fleet of La Rochelle does not sit neatly on one side of the line between history and fantasy. It sits across the line, with one foot in documented crisis and the other in the deep mud of later speculation. So we have to separate the layers. There is the hard ground. In October 1307, the French crown moved suddenly and aggressively against the Knights Templar. The arrests were coordinated. The order's property became the object of royal attention. La Rochelle was a significant Atlantic port connected to the maritime and logistical world in which an international order could operate. The Templars had wealth, records, personnel, and reasons to protect whatever could be moved before hostile hands reached it. That is the foundation. Then there is the plausible ground. The Templars may have had warning, partial or imperfect, that danger was approaching. Ships connected to their network may have left before they could be seized. Movable wealth, documents, or people may have been transported elsewhere. Some former members or assets may have found refuge in places where Philip IV's power was weaker. Portugal provides a clear example of institutional transformation, while Scotland remains a possible but less securely documented refuge for individuals. This layer is not fantasy, but it is not certainty either. Then there is the mist. Here we find the full treasure fleet, the sacred relics, the secret archives that overturn religious history, the decisive intervention at Bannockburn, the Atlantic crossing to unknown lands, the hidden New World traces, and the long thread from Templar sailors to pirates. These stories are not all equal. Some contain small pieces of practical possibility. Others lean heavily on resemblance, silence, and the magnetism of the Templar name. The problem is not imagination itself. Imagination is useful when it helps us ask better questions. The problem begins when imagination starts answering those questions before evidence has arrived. The Templars have suffered from a peculiar kind of fame. They are famous enough that every gap around them feels meaningful. If a record is missing, it must be hidden. If a symbol is ambiguous, it must be theirs. If a ship is unaccounted for, it must be carrying treasure. If a later institution survives with any resemblance to their structure, it must be their secret continuation. This is how a historical order becomes a universal explanation. And universal explanations are rarely trustworthy. A more careful investigation does not drain the mystery of power. It sharpens it. Once we remove the decorations added by later centuries, the central puzzle becomes clearer and, in some ways, more unsettling. We are not forced to believe in a flawless conspiracy or a fleet bound for America. We are left with something colder, a powerful institution under threat, a port capable of movement, a political strike prepared in secrecy, and an absence that the surviving record does not fully explain. That is enough. It is easy to underestimate how much mystery can survive without exaggeration. The real history of the Templars already contains ambition, debt, fear, coercion, legal manipulation, institutional collapse, and the struggle to control memory after destruction. It does not need every additional legend to remain compelling. In fact, the legends can sometimes make the story smaller by turning a complex political and human disaster into a scavenger hunt. Treasure is easier than power. A hidden relic is easier than a corrupted trial. A secret voyage is easier than the slow violence of administration. That may be why the most dramatic versions keep returning. They give the story a shape that feels morally satisfying. The order is betrayed, but it escapes. The king seizes buildings, but misses the true prize. The church condemns, but hidden knowledge survives. The fleet vanishes, but only because it is carrying the future somewhere beyond the reach of its enemies. It is a beautiful pattern. It may also be the pattern we wish history had followed. The documentary record, such as it is, refuses to be that generous. It gives us fragments, not completion. It gives us legal processes, not secret maps. It gives us accusations and inventories, but not the final harbor log viewers might hope for. It lets us see the machinery that crushed the order, while leaving uncertain what slipped through that machinery before it closed. And that uncertainty is important. Historians are sometimes accused of ruining good mysteries by asking for evidence. But evidence does not ruin mystery. It protects it from becoming meaningless. If every claim is accepted because it sounds exciting, then the missing fleet can go anywhere, carry anything, become anyone, and explain everything. At that point, the mystery has not expanded. It has dissolved. A good mystery has edges. We can say that the order was real. The crisis was real. The port was real. The need to protect movable assets was real. The survival of Templar structures in altered forms, especially in Portugal, was real. The wider uncertainty around ships, cargo, and personnel is real. We cannot honestly say that a documented Templar armada sailed from La Rochelle to Scotland, won Bannockburn, deposited sacred archives in Portugal, crossed the Atlantic, reached the Americas, and later seeded pirate traditions. That is not a historical conclusion. It is a chain of attractions. One link pulls on the next because it wants to. Yet even when the chain breaks, something remains. The vanished fleet matters because it reveals how history is made from both presence and absence. We know the arrests happened because power left records when it acted. We know the order was attacked because kings, clerics, and courts generated documents. But the people who moved quietly, if they moved at all, may have left fewer traces. The successful escape, the careful transfer, the discreet sale, the hidden archive, the changed name, these are exactly the kinds of actions least likely to announce themselves. That creates a strange imbalance. Power documents itself. Evasion often does not. So the absence at La Rochelle may be suspicious, but it is also resistant. It refuses to become proof. It invites theories, then punishes certainty. It allows plausible reconstruction, then withdraws before the final claim can be made. This is where evidence and imagination must learn to share the room without pretending to be the same person. Imagination can help us see what might have been possible. A warning carried through trusted channels, documents bundled in haste, a captain told to sail before dawn, a ship renamed in another port, a former brother becoming a soldier under a different lord. These scenes are not proven, but they are rooted in human behavior and political pressure. Evidence tells us when to stop. It says, possible is not proven. Suggestive is not certain. Absence is not confession. Later tradition is not contemporary testimony. A symbol is not a signature. A silence is not automatically a cover-up. That discipline may feel severe, but it is what keeps the Templars from being swallowed by their own mythology. The most honest conclusion is not that the fleet definitely escaped with the treasure of the order. It is not that the fleet never existed in the form later stories describe. It is not that every legend is false or that every suspicion is justified. The honest conclusion is narrower. Something about La Rochelle remains unresolved because the surviving record does not answer the questions later generations most want answered. The port's importance, the timing of the arrests, the order's maritime capacity, and the possibility of advance warning create a real historical tension. Around that tension, centuries of imagination have grown. Some of that imagination may preserve distorted memories of real movements. Some of it may be pure invention. Most of it now lives somewhere in between, where stories go when they are too compelling to die and too unsupported to be trusted. And perhaps that is the proper place to leave the investigation for a moment. Not with a verdict, but with proportion. The vanished fleet is not proven legend. It is not confirmed history in the fullest sense. It is a question formed by the collision of politics, maritime possibility, lost records, and human desire. The danger is believing too much. The greater danger, perhaps, is noticing too little. Because behind the grand stories of treasure and secret voyages is a quieter lesson about power. When institutions fall, what survives is not always what was strongest, holiest, or most valuable. Sometimes what survives is what could move fastest, change names, avoid paperwork, or pass through a harbor before anyone understood that the age of safety was over. That may be the most believable secret of La Rochelle. Not that the Templars escaped history, but that some part of them may have escaped the inventory. The vanished fleet survived because it became useful to the imagination. That may sound like an insult to the story, but it is not. Some mysteries survive because they remain factually unresolved. Others survive because they answer a need in the people who inherit them. The ships of La Rochelle do both. They sit in a genuine historical uncertainty, and they also offer something modern culture finds almost irresistible: the possibility that official defeat was not the end. The Templars were destroyed in public. The fleet, if the legend is right, escaped in private. That contrast is powerful. It gives the story a shape that feels almost mythic. On land, the order is arrested, interrogated, discredited, and dismantled. At sea, something slips away before the trap closes. The king wins the visible battle, but perhaps not the hidden one. Authority writes the official ending, but the horizon refuses to sign it. No wonder writers, filmmakers, treasure hunters, and conspiracy theorists keep returning to it. The Templars have become one of those rare historical subjects that can carry almost any kind of story placed upon them. They can be holy warriors, corrupt bankers, innocent victims, secret heretics, hidden guardians, early explorers, political scapegoats, or architects of mysteries that reach far beyond the Middle Ages. They are flexible enough for entertainment, and serious enough to make the entertainment feel weighty. That flexibility is dangerous for history, but it is excellent for legend. In books and films, the missing fleet offers a perfect opening. A ship leaves France. A chest is hidden. A symbol appears centuries later. A scholar finds a clue. A secret society knows more than it should. The structure practically writes itself, which is sometimes the problem. The better the story works as fiction, the easier it becomes to mistake narrative satisfaction for historical likelihood. The real Templars were not built for our genres. They did not know they were supposed to become a mystery franchise. They lived in a medieval world of vows, property, warfare, prayer, debt, logistics, and political vulnerability. Their downfall was not a puzzle designed for later viewers to solve with maps and symbols. It was a crisis of power. A king needed control. An order had become exposed. The church navigated pressure and embarrassment. Men suffered in prisons and courts. Estates changed hands. Names were stained. Records scattered. But modern culture often prefers the clean thrill of the hidden clue. A lost archive is easier to follow than a legal procedure. A treasure ship is easier to market than a property transfer. A secret voyage is more exciting than the slow redistribution of assets after suppression. And so the missing fleet became a doorway through which every later fascination could enter. This is how legend grows. It does not usually invent everything from nothing. It begins with a real event, or a real gap, or a real contradiction. Then it adds emotional logic. If the order was wealthy, there must be treasure. If there was treasure, it must have been hidden. If ships were missing, they must have carried it. If they carried it, they must have gone somewhere meaningful. If the destination is unknown, it may as well be the most interesting place available. Each step feels small. Together, they build a cathedral of speculation. The legacy of the vanished fleet is therefore not only about the Templars, It is about how modern people relate to history when the record disappoints them. We often say we want the truth, and we do. But we also want the truth to have shape, irony, justice, and a final reveal. We want the powerful to miss something. We want the condemned to preserve a secret. We want the archive to contain a page that turns confusion into revelation. The Templar fleet gives us the promise of that page, even if the page may not exist. This is why the story can appear in so many forms. In one version, it is a treasure mystery. In another, a religious conspiracy. In another, an alternative history of exploration. In another, a symbol of resistance against monarchy and church. Each version chooses the Templars it needs. For some, the order represents hidden wisdom. For others, financial power. For others, persecution. For others, the seductive idea that history has a second layer beneath the official one, and that only a few patient minds can read it. That idea is not foolish by itself. Official histories are often incomplete. Powerful institutions do shape records. Victors do influence memory. Archives do conceal as much through accident as through intention. The problem is not suspicion. Suspicion can be healthy. The problem is when suspicion becomes a machine that produces certainty from absence. The Vanished Fleet asks us to resist that machine while still respecting the mystery. It asks us to admit that something may have happened without pretending we know exactly what. It asks us to hold a space between denial and fantasy. That is not always easy, especially in a culture that rewards the loudest answer rather than the most careful one. A careful answer rarely wins a thumbnail, but it may last longer. The modern fascination with the Templars also reveals a deeper unease about institutions. We recognize, perhaps too well, the idea of a powerful organization being dismantled through accusation, legal pressure, and control of public narrative. We understand how reputation can be destroyed before truth is settled. We understand how money, politics, and morality can become tangled until no one can easily separate justice from convenience. The Templar story feels old because of its costumes. It feels modern because of its mechanics. A state moves against an institution it fears or desires. Charges become public weapons. Confession and evidence blur. Property becomes destiny. The official explanation may be partly true, partly manufactured, or partly irrelevant to the real motive. And somewhere inside the collapse, people try to save what they can before the door closes. That is not merely medieval. That is human. The fleet, then, becomes a symbol of the part of any story that escapes the official record. It represents the uncounted assets, the unnamed survivors, the documents no one inventories, the decisions made in private when public catastrophe becomes unavoidable. Whether the ships went to Scotland, Portugal, elsewhere in the Atlantic, or simply into the ordinary churn of maritime life, they have come to stand for the possibility that history is never entirely captured by the people who claim to finish it. That is why the image endures. Not because it is proven in its most dramatic form, because it expresses a truth that evidence alone sometimes struggles to satisfy. Power can destroy much, but rarely everything. The Missing Fleet has influenced popular culture because it offers an elegant rebellion against closure. The arrests of 1,307 look final. The suppression looks final. The execution of leaders, the transfer of properties, the blackening of the name, all of it seems to say the order ended where authority said it ended. Then the harbor appears, empty, and the story breathes again. This is the legacy of La Rochelle, an empty space that became more durable than many confirmed facts. People remember the ships that may not be fully documented, because the absence gives them room to think, to doubt, to invent. and sometimes to research, too. The danger is that imagination may overrun evidence. The value is that imagination keeps asking questions the official record left unanswered. Both things can be true. The vanished fleet is not just a medieval mystery. It is a mirror held up to our appetite for secret histories. It shows how quickly we turn gaps into plots, but also how necessary it is to notice gaps in the first place. Without curiosity, the story dies under the weight of official conclusion. Without discipline, it floats away into fantasy. The best telling stays between those dangers. It lets the ships remain uncertain. It lets La Rochelle remain a port, not a portal. It lets the Templars remain human, powerful, flawed, devout, political, useful, vulnerable, and caught in forces larger than any single legend can contain. And perhaps that is why the story still works after 7 centuries. Not because it gives us an answer, but because it gives us a question with a coastline. We can walk along it. We can see where the ground is firm. We can see where the tide has taken the rest. Somewhere beyond that line, the fleet becomes culture. It sails through novels, documentaries, symbols, theories, and late-night conversations. Its cargo changes with every generation. Gold for one age, forbidden knowledge for another, lost maps for another, proof of injustice for another. The ships carry what we put inside them. But the first cargo was uncertainty, and uncertainty, unlike timber, does not rot. The central question returns as quietly as it began. Where did the ships go? After all the routes, all the theories, all the borrowed symbols and inherited rumors, the answer remains incomplete. The fleet of La Rochelle, if it vanished in the way later tradition remembers, did not leave behind the kind of evidence that allows history to close the file. No surviving manifest settles the cargo. No confirmed harbor record gives us the destination. No witness account, secure and contemporary, stands on the quay and names the vessels as they pass into the Atlantic. That is frustrating. It is also the reason the story still breathes. What we can say with more confidence is that the disappearance belongs to a moment when the Templar world was under mortal pressure. Philip IV's arrests were not a local dispute. They were a coordinated royal assault against one of the most powerful religious military orders in Europe. The Templars had enemies. They had assets. They had records. They had maritime reach. They had reason, if warned even imperfectly, to move whatever could be moved before the net closed. But beyond that, the water deepens. Perhaps the ships sailed south, toward safer hands and altered names. Perhaps some reached Portugal, where the Templar inheritance found a legal afterlife in the Order of Christ. Perhaps individual men drifted north into Scotland, where war could absorb useful strangers without asking too loudly who they had once served. Perhaps the vessels scattered across Atlantic routes, sold, renamed, repaired, and slowly dissolved into ordinary maritime life. Or perhaps the legend has enlarged a smaller truth. A few absent ships, a missing inventory, a rumor of departure, a port that faced the open sea. History often begins with less than legend needs, and legend supplies the rest with confidence. Still, there is a reason this particular mystery feels different from a simple tale of buried treasure. The vanished fleet sits at the intersection of power and escape. On land, the Templars were counted, accused, imprisoned, and stripped of their identity. At sea, something may have passed outside that counting. The contrast is almost unbearable to the imagination. The king's hand closing over stone buildings and captured men, while beyond the harbor mouth, sails move into weather he cannot command. That image may not be fully provable, but it explains why the question survived. Every age has its own La Rochelle, a place where the official story reaches the edge of its authority and has to stop. Beyond that point, the record becomes uncertain. Not empty, exactly. Not meaningless. Just unfinished. And unfinished history has a way of gathering the fears and desires of those who come later. For some, the missing fleet carries gold. For others, forbidden knowledge. For others, proof that the Templars were victims rather than villains. For others, the hope that powerful institutions can be wounded without being completely destroyed. The ships become whatever the age most wants to rescue from the past. But the careful answer is more restrained and perhaps more haunting. If the fleet disappeared, it may have carried no single world-changing secret. It may have carried something more ordinary and more human. Documents, coins, trusted brothers, sailors, instructions, debts, names, and the fragile tools of survival. It may have carried an institution's attempt to keep a fragment of itself alive after the center had been struck. That is enough. We do not need to imagine the Templars discovering continents or guarding impossible relics to feel the weight of the story. A group of men saw danger approaching. Some may have moved before the blow fell. Some did not. Some were trapped. Some perhaps escaped. The record caught the violence of the arrest more clearly than the subtlety of the evasion, and that imbalance is the whole mystery. Power leaves paperwork when it attacks. Escape leaves less. The final truth may be lost, not because someone hid it perfectly, but because no one preserved the right details at the right time. A captain's name forgotten. A ship renamed. A ledger destroyed. A clerk uninterested. A witness unable to write. A chest delivered to a place that later called it something else. A vessel broken into timber before anyone understood it had become evidence. That is how the past disappears. Not always through conspiracy, sometimes through use, sometimes through weather, sometimes through success. If the ships were meant to evade Philip's seizure, then the absence that frustrates us may be the very sign that the plan worked. Not completely, not gloriously, not with the clean perfection of legend, but enough that something slipped away. And if nothing slipped away, if the fleet was never the grand missing armada later writers imagined, then the mystery still teaches us something valuable. It shows how quickly a real political catastrophe can become a stage for deeper anxieties. About secret wealth, corrupted justice, lost knowledge, and the feeling that official history has counted the bodies but missed the soul of the event. The Templars were suppressed. That much belongs to history. The fleet was never fully recovered by certainty. That belongs to mystery. Between those two statements lies the enduring power of La Rochelle, not a solved case, not a fantasy to swallow whole, a wound in the record, shaped like an empty harbor. And perhaps that is the most honest ending available. We stand, in imagination, at the edge of the Atlantic. Behind us are the arrests, the sealed orders, the interrogations, the inventories, the collapse of a name that once carried fear and prestige across Christendom. Before us is the water, indifferent and immense. Somewhere beyond it, the ships may have become cargo, wreckage, rumor, or nothing at all. No bell rings. No archive opens. No final map is handed down. Only the question remains, patient as the tide. Where did they go? Maybe to Scotland. Maybe to Portugal. Maybe into the Atlantic routes where names could be changed and origins forgotten. Maybe only into legend. But if those ships did leave before the arrests began, then their greatest secret may not be what they carried. It may be that, for one brief moment, before the king's men reached the harbor, the doomed order still had time to choose a direction, and history has been watching the horizon ever since.